You curtsy to no one here. You are no one." The words struck the grand hall of Ellsworth Court like a thrown glass, and the laughter that chased them was colder still. Crystal goblets caught the chandelier light as Lady Cressida Vane lifted her chin, certain the plainly dressed woman near the servant's door was beneath even the courtesy of contempt. The woman in the gray wool gown lowered her eyes. She did not flinch. She did not weep. She only folded her chapped hands and went very still, the kind of stillness that should have frightened them all. It did not. No one in that glittering room noticed the cold and ancient power sleeping in her silence. No one saw that she had been taught to bow only to crowns, and that she had bowed to none in 7 long years. Beyond the tall frosted windows, past the gravel drive, a black carriage bearing a crest no English family could name had already turned through the iron gates. By the time the clock struck 10, every proud soul beneath that roof would learn exactly whose presence they had ordered to stand aside. But before we continue, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time you saw this video. Tonight's story is one you will never forget. Now, let us return to the beginning. Her name was Annalise, though at Ellsworth Court they called her only the foreign girl, or the mute, or simply you, when they called her anything at all. She had come to England 7 years before with nothing but a sea-stained cloak and a silence that the household took for stupidity. The truth was far stranger and far more dangerous to the people who mocked her, though none of them would have believed it if she had stood upon the banquet table and shouted it to the rafters. She had been raised in the marble palaces of a small northern kingdom across the cold sea, a kingdom of pine forests and frozen lakes, and a winter court that prized dignity above all things. She had learned 6 languages before she learned to fear. She had been taught which fork, which bow, which silence each occasion required. And then, in a single blood-red autumn, soldiers had come for her family in the night, and a loyal nurse had wrapped her in a servant's shawl and pressed her aboard a fishing boat bound for England, whispering that she must never, ever say her true name aloud until the right person came to claim it. 7 years she had waited. 7 years she had carried trays and emptied basins and held her tongue, and the waiting had taught her something her tutors never could. It had taught her exactly how the powerful behave when they believe no one of consequence is watching. To understand what she had endured, you must understand the kingdom she had lost. In the far north, across a sea that froze gray at its edges each winter, stood the marble palaces of the House of the White Pine, a court older than England's grandest dukedom, where the snow lay blue in the long shadows and the great hall smelled of pine resin and beeswax and cold stone. Annalise had been the only daughter of King Aldrich III, a quiet and just man who had taught her that a crown is not a thing one wears, but a thing one carries. A weight of duty laid upon the shoulders of those born to serve their people rather than themselves. She had been raised among tutors and ministers and the soft, endless courtesy of a winter court, taught to read the law in 3 tongues, to dance the slow measures of the North, to sit a horse and hold her tongue and never, never let her face betray her heart before strangers. She had been loved. That was the thing she remembered most in the years that came after, not the marble or the jewels, but the simple fact of having been loved, of having mattered to 100 faces who lit when she entered a room. And then the long peace had broken. A cousin of her father, a man with an army and a grievance and no patience for the slow turning of the law, had risen in a single blood-red autumn and seized the white pine throne by force. He had meant to leave no rival living, for a usurper sleeps badly while the true blood breathes. The night the soldiers came, Annaliese's old nurse, a woman named Greta, with hands like worn leather and a heart like a hearthstone, had not screamed and had not wept. She had wrapped the child in the servant's gray shawl, smeared ash upon her royal face, and carried her down through the kitchens and out a cold door into the dark, whispering the whole way that she must forget she was a princess, that she must answer to any name but her own, that she must say nothing of who she was until the right person came to claim her, a person who would bow. They had reached the harbor before dawn. Greta had pressed her aboard a fishing boat bound for England with a purse of coins sewn into the hem of the shawl, and she had stood upon the freezing dock as the boat pulled away, growing smaller. And Annalise had never seen her again. The old nurse had given her own life that night so that the child might keep hers. It was the first lesson Annalise ever learned about what the loyal will do and what the loyal are worth, and she carried it with her into 7 years of silence below the stairs. England had not been kind. A foreign child with no name and a strange accent and a sea-stained shawl was passed from household to household like an unwanted parcel, set to scrub and fetch and carry, struck when she was slow and ignored when she was quick. She learned English from the scolding of cooks. She learned to make herself small, to keep her eyes down, to swallow the court accent that would have marked her as something other than a drudge. By the time she came at last to Ellsworth Court, 3 years before this winter night, she had perfected the art the cruel never suspect their servants of possessing. She had learned to watch. She watched everything, and she understood far more than anyone in that grand counterfeit house ever dreamed a foreign mute could understand. Ellsworth Court was a beautiful house trying very hard to look old. The Vane family had bought their barony with railway money 2 generations back, and they spent a fortune each year reminding everyone of a heritage they did not have. The marble in the entrance hall had been shipped from Italy and laid only 12 years before. The portraits on the staircase were of strangers, purchased at auction to suggest ancestors, and Lady Cressida had taken to naming them as though they were her own grandfathers, inventing battles they had fought and titles they had held until she half believed the lies herself. The library was full of handsome books with uncut pages that no one had ever read. The silver was new, but acid-aged to look ancient. Everything in that house was a performance, and the cruelest part of the performance was the staff. Lady Cressida Vane, mistress of the house, understood instinctively that the surest way to seem nobly born was to be cruel to those born below her. And she practiced that cruelty as another woman might practice the pianoforte, daily and with great seriousness. She docked wages for imagined faults. She read the maid's letters aloud at her dressing table for sport. She had once turned a footman of 30 years' service into the road in January because he had coughed during one of her dinners. She had a daughter, Ophelia, who had learned cruelty at her mother's knee and wielded it with a younger woman's careless flourish, and a husband, the Baron, who signed whatever his wife placed before him and spent his afternoons asleep in the library among the books no one read. The household ran on fear and on imported flowers and on the unpaid debts that Lady Cressida hid behind ever grander dinners. For Annalise had learned one more secret in her years below the stairs, a secret the family did not know she knew. The towering arrangements of hothouse lilies, the river of champagne, the roast pheasant and glazed quail and silver tureens of clear consomme, the buttered asparagus and candied figs and trembling custards, all of it was bought on credit. The Vanes were drowning. Lady Cressida had mortgaged the very chandeliers above their heads to pay for the season's dinners, gambling everything on a single throw, the marriage of her daughter to a fortune that would save them. And the fortune she hunted was about to arrive at her own front door, carried in a black carriage bearing a crest no English family could name. The occasion that winter night was the grandest dinner Ellsworth Court had ever attempted. A delegation had come from across the cold sea, the envoys of a northern kingdom, led by a man the English papers called only the ambassador, a tall gray gentleman with eyes like a frozen lake and a manner that made dukes feel like footmen. He had come on royal business that no one in the county understood, and Lady Cressida had spent 4 months and a fortune she did not have to win the honor of hosting him. She believed, in the small and frantic engine of her heart, that if she could only dazzle these foreigners, the ambassador might be persuaded to look kindly upon her daughter, and that a marriage into a northern court would lift the Vanes forever above the railway money and the whispers. She did not know that the ambassador had not come to England for her daughter at all. She did not know that he had crossed a winter sea on a single faint and unbelievable rumor, a rumor that a lost child of his royal house, mourned for dead these 7 years, might yet be living somewhere in the cold green counties of England, and that he had sworn upon his honor not to return home without her. For the staff of Ellsworth Court there had been no rest in a fortnight. The whole house had been turned inside out and scrubbed to a punishing shine, the marble polished till it threw back faces, the silver buffed by candlelight until the undermaid's hands cracked and bled. Wagons had come up the drive for days, laden with crates of French champagne and Spanish oranges and wheels of cheese from across the sea, with bolts of new damask for the windows and hothouse flowers grown at ruinous expense in the dead of winter. Lilies and white roses and trailing ivy that perfumed the cold halls like a southern garden. None of it was paid for. Every crate had come on the promise of payment after the season, and the merchants of 3 counties were beginning, very quietly, to talk among themselves. But Lady Cressida heard none of that talk. She walked her transformed house in a fever of triumph, certain that this single glittering night would purchase her family's future, and she drove her servants like a coachman flogging a foundering team, certain, too, that their suffering was simply the natural order of a world arranged for her convenience. The afternoon before the dinner, the great kitchens of Ellsworth Court boiled like a battlefield. Lady Cressida swept through them in sapphire silk, finding fault with everything, her voice rising to a shriek over a sauce, a wilted stem, a smudge on a silver fork. And it was there, with her sleeves rolled and her hands red in the scullery water, that Annalise first felt the old life brush against her like a draught from an open door. A young scullery maid named Sarah, no more than 14, dropped a tray of crystal and stood frozen in terror as the glasses shattered across the flagstones. Lady Cressida turned upon the child like a hawk. She seized the girl by the wrist and lifted her hand to strike, and the whole kitchen held its breath. But Annalise stepped between them, quiet as a shadow, and took the blow that had been meant for the child upon her own raised arm. The room went silent. Lady Cressida's eyes narrowed at the gray-gowned woman who had dared to interpose herself. "You insolent creature," she said very softly, for soft was always worse with her. You curtsy to no one here. You are no one. Clean this filth, and if a single guest tonight so much as glimpses your wretched face, I will turn you into the snow without a character or a coin. Do you understand me?" Annalise lowered her eyes and said nothing. She knelt upon the cold stone and began to gather the broken crystal into her apron, and only the trembling child saw that the foreign woman's hands did not shake at all. When Lady Cressida had gone, Annalise pressed a clean cloth into Sura's palm and murmured, in her soft, accented English, "Be brave a little longer. Storms do not last. Even the longest winter ends." The girl did not understand then what she had been promised. She would understand by morning. That evening the great hall of Ellsworth Court blazed as it had never blazed before. 100 candles doubled in the tall mirrors. The crystal chandeliers, mortgaged to the last drop, threw their light across polished marble and towering white lilies and a long table laid with more silver than 3 honest fortunes could buy. The county gentry arrived in their finest, and at the heart of them all sat the ambassador and his grave northern delegation, dark-clad and watchful, speaking little, missing nothing. Ophelia Vane had been arranged at the ambassador's right hand like a jewel in a setting, gowned in white and dripping with borrowed diamonds, and Lady Cressida hovered and shone and laughed too loudly, certain that the great prize of her life was very nearly within her grasp. And because she could not bear to let a single triumph pass unsalted by another's humiliation, Lady Cressida had decreed that the foreign drudge would serve at the high table that night after all, not out of mercy, out of spite. She wanted the ambassador's people to see how an English noblewoman commanded the lesser races of the earth. She wanted Annalise paraded before them in her gray wool and her plain cap, carrying trays, eyes down, a living footstool, so that the contrast with shimmering Ophelia might be the more complete. "Let them see," she had said to her daughter behind her fan, "how we keep such creatures in their place. Foreigners respect only strength." Before the soup was served, Lady Cressida found one last cruelty to spend, as Annalise stood waiting near the sideboard with the tureen. The mistress of the house swept past on her way to her place and paused just long enough for the nearest guest to hear, to pluck at the gray wool of Annalise's sleeve with 2 fingers as one might lift a dead thing. "Do try not to breathe upon the food creature," she said, smiling for the table. Our northern guests are accustomed to civilization, and when you have done pouring, you will kneel in the corner there, where the great ambassador may see what a properly governed household looks like. A lady's strength is best shown in how low she keeps her lessers. Ophelia laughed, a bright cruel peal, and added, loud enough to carry, "Mother, perhaps she might sing for them." "Do foreigners sing, or only grunt?" The county gentry tittered. The northern delegation watched in silence, their faces unreadable. And Annalise, who had been a princess of an ancient house while the Vanes were still counting railway shillings, lowered her eyes and said nothing at all, and only the trembling Sura, peering from the service door, saw that the foreign lady's jaw had set like carved stone. And so Annalise came up to the high table, bearing a silver tureen of consomme, and began to move among the very people who had come across a winter sea to find her. What happened next, no one in that room could have foreseen, though Annalise felt it gathering like the pressure before a storm. As she leaned to set the consomme before the delegation, the northern envoys fell, one by one, into a strange and total silence, for they were speaking among themselves in their own tongue, the old court language of their kingdom, certain that not a soul in England could understand them, and they were speaking of cruel and careless things. "Look how these railway barons play at nobility," murmured one. "The mother sells her daughter like a horse at market." "And the girl is a fool, all teeth and no wit," said another, laughing low. "The ambassador will be gone by Thursday. We have wasted a sea crossing on a rumor and a ghost. There is no lost princess in this cold, wet country. She died 7 years ago with the rest of them. We chase a phantom while this vulgar woman pours us cheap champagne and calls it Tuesday." And the youngest of the envoys, a sharp-faced man named Lord Henrik, who had crossed the sea reluctantly and grudged every mile of it, leaned to the ambassador and said in the old court tongue, "Low and impatient, my lord, let us be done with this farce. There is no lost princess. The harbor records are 7 years cold. We have toured 9 houses of 9 vulgar English families, each one parading a daughter at us like a horse at fair, and this one is the worst, a counterfeit court built on coal smoke and credit. The king at home grows stronger by the week. If we return empty-handed, we return to a usurper's mercy. Better we admit the child is dead and make our peace with the new throne than chase a ghost through these wet green hills until our heads are forfeit." He emptied his glass and held it out, without looking, for the gray-gowned servant to fill. "Fill it, girl," he said in English, carelessly. "At least the wine in this graveyard is drinkable." They spoke freely, cruelly, certain of their privacy, never glancing at the gray-gowned servant who refilled their glasses. And Annalise, pouring the consomme with a steady hand, understood every single word. The language of her childhood, the language her mother had sung her to sleep in, washed over her after 7 years of silence, and it took the whole of her ancient training not to weep. Not to drop the tureen, not to answer them in the tongue they thought no English woman alive could speak. She set down the consomme. She straightened. And she made one small choice that would unmake 3 families before the night was through. She allowed herself, for the briefest instant, to meet the ambassador's frozen lake eyes directly, the way no servant ever should, the way only an equal dares. And in that single unguarded glance, he saw something that stopped the breath in his chest. He saw the eyes of his dead king. He had served King Aldrich III for 30 years, had stood at his right hand in war and in peace, had carried his coffin upon his own shoulder when the usurper paraded it through the streets. And here, in a vulgar English banquet hall, pouring soup in a gray wool gown, was that same gray-blue gaze, that same set of the brow, the living image of the man he had mourned. For one wild instant the old diplomat thought his grief had at last unseated his reason. Then the servant moved on down the table, and he watched the way she carried herself even now, even in rags, even bearing a tureen, the unmistakable carriage of someone taught from the cradle that a spine does not bend, and he knew. He knew the way one knows a face in a dream. The rumor was no rumor. The ghost was no ghost. She was here. She had been here, perhaps, the whole 7 years they had searched the wrong harbors and the wrong cities, hidden in plain sight in the last place a princess would ever be sought. Below the stares of people too proud to look at the woman who served them. But the ambassador was a careful man, schooled in patience, and he gave no sign. He looked away. He sipped his consomme, and he began very quietly to watch the gray-gowned woman with the stillness of a hunter who has heard, at last, the thing he crossed an ocean to find. Lady Cressida, seeing only that the great man's attention had wandered from her daughter to a servant, felt a hot spike of fury and resolved to crush the impertinence at once. She rapped her fan against her glass for silence, and the long table turned to her. "It seems," she said, with a smile like a blade, "that our little foreigner has forgotten her place. How fitting, on a night like this, to remind her of it. Tell me, girl," she turned her glittering eyes upon Annalise, who stood now at the center of the hall with 100 faces upon her. "What was your name in whatever frozen hovel you crawled from? Speak it, so all our noble guests may hear what manner of creature serves their soup. Go on. Or have you no name at all, you mute and graceless thing?" Ophelia tittered behind her fan. The county gentry leaned in, scenting blood. It was, Lady Cressida believed, the perfect cruelty the foreign drudge made to confess her own nothingness before the very court she hoped to dazzle. She had no idea that she had just commanded before a hall full of witnesses the one thing Annalise had been forbidden for 7 years to do. She had ordered her to say her name. And the great hall waited. The gray-gowned woman lifted her head. She did not lower her eyes this time. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and clear and carried to the farthest candle. And it was not the broken servant's English they had mocked. It was the cold, pure court accent of the North, every word a struck bell. "My name," she said, "is Annalise Sigrid Veldemar, daughter of King Aldrich III, of the House of the White Pine, by the grace of God, Princess of the Northern Realm, mourned these 7 years for dead." The silence that followed was not a silence. It was a wound. And into that wound the ambassador rose to his feet, and the whole northern delegation rose with him, and as one, in a sweep of dark cloth that sent the candlelight shivering, they bowed. Not the small bow of guests, the deep, full, formal bow of subjects to a sovereign, foreheads low, hands upon their hearts. "Your Royal Highness," said the ambassador, and his iron voice cracked like river ice in spring. "We have crossed the cold sea to find you. The realm has prayed for you. God in heaven, we had nearly believed the rumor false." He lifted his eyes, bright and wet, to the woman in gray wool. "It is you. By the king your father's own eyes, it is truly you." And Lord Henrik, the young envoy, who had called her a ghost and a farce not 10 minutes past, who had ordered her to fill his glass in the same breath that he wished her dead and forgotten, went the color of ash. He had spoken treason against his own princess to her very face, certain she could not understand, and she had poured his wine and said nothing. He sank to one knee upon the marble, and his voice when it came was hoarse with shame. "Your Highness," he managed, "forgive me." "God forgive me. I did not know. I did not know." Annalise looked down at him, and there was no triumph in her face, only a great and weary calm. "You did not know," she agreed quietly. "That is precisely the point, my lord. None of you knew. You spoke your truest thoughts to a servant because you believed a servant could not matter. Remember this night, all of you, when next you are certain that the one pouring your wine cannot understand you. The world is full of listening silences. For a long moment no one in the great hall of Ellsworth Court drew breath. Ophelia Vane sat with her borrowed diamonds and her mouth open and no sound coming out. The Baron woke from his wine and looked about him in confusion. And Lady Cressida, who had ordered this woman to confess her nothingness, who had struck her in the kitchens that very afternoon and threatened to turn her into the snow, felt the floor of her whole bright counterfeit world tilt slowly beneath her feet. The servant, the mute, the foreign girl, a princess of the blood of an ancient crowned house beside which the Vanes' railway barony was less than dust, and she, Cressida Vane, had struck her across the arm not 8 hours past, before witnesses, in her own scullery. Annalise stepped forward. The gray wool gown, the plain cap, none of it mattered now, for power does not live in cloth, and everyone in that hall could feel the difference. She had stopped being a servant the moment she spoke her name, and she would never be one again. She looked, for the first time, fully upon Lady Cressida, and her gaze was not cruel. It was worse than cruel. It was calm. "You asked for my name, my lady," she said softly. "I have given it. You said I curtsy to no one here. That is the only true thing you have ever said to me. I curtsy to no one in England. There is no one in England to whom I owe one." She let the words settle like snow. "Some debts," she went on, very quietly, "grow larger the longer they are left unpaid. And tonight I find that a great many people in this house owe me a very great deal." The ambassador's voice cut across the frozen room, formal and final. "Your Highness, by the authority of the crown I serve, I am bound to ask, these people, how have they used you?" And here Annalise might have lied. She might in her dignity have softened it, smoothed it over, let the veins keep their pride. She did not. She did not need to lie, for the truth was enough, and the truth was standing all around her in the form of trembling kitchen maids and frightened footmen who had watched for 7 years and said nothing because no one had ever dared to ask them. "Ask the servants of this house," she said. "They will tell you. Ask the child Sarah, who was struck this very afternoon for breaking a glass. Ask the footmen who go unpaid while the mistress mortgages the very lights above us to buy this dinner. I have stood in the silence of this house for 7 years, my Lord Ambassador, and I have seen its true face. It is not a noble house, it only wears the costume of one." And then the servants came, one by one, summoned by the ambassador's grave nod. They crept up from the kitchens and in from the corridors, and they told it. The unpaid wages, the cruelty. The little Sarah lifted her chin and described the blow she had taken that afternoon, and how the foreign lady had stepped in to bear it for her. And the whole hall heard it, and the whole hall understood at last what manner of woman Lady Cressida Vane truly was. The county gentry, who had laughed with her an hour before, began very quietly to move their chairs away from her, the way the living draw back from the plague. Lady Cressida, when at last her voice returned to her, did the only thing such people ever know to do when the ground gives way beneath them. She tried to laugh it off, to make it a charming misunderstanding, to pretend she had known all along, to claim she had sheltered the dear princess out of the goodness of her noble heart. "Your Highness," she fluttered, sinking into a curtsy so deep she nearly toppled. "What a joy, what a blessing, to have nurtured greatness beneath my own roof. Had I but known, I would have given you the finest chambers in the house. We are practically family. You must let me make amends. A small celebration in your honor perhaps here, where you have been so very happy with us." The hall was so silent that the guttering of a single candle could be heard. Annalise let her finish. Then she said, gently, and the gentleness was the most terrible thing in the room, "I have been many things beneath your roof, my lady. Happy was never among them. You struck me this afternoon. You called me no one. You ordered me to kneel in a corner so that your guests might admire how low you could press a human soul. I will not pretend, as you do, that the words of an hour ago were never spoken. There were witnesses." And she turned her face, for the first time, away from Lady Cressida, as one turns from a thing one has finished examining. And that turning was a sentence more final than any words. What followed over the weeks that came did not require Annalise to lift a single finger, for the world itself delivered the reckoning, as the world so often does once the truth is finally spoken aloud. The ambassador's secretary, a man of relentless thoroughness, made discreet inquiries into the affairs of Ellsworth Court, and what he found he placed, without comment, in the hands of the family's creditors. The debts so long hidden behind grander and grander dinners were called in all at once. The mortgage chandeliers were carried out into the snow. The imported marble, the strangers' portraits, the very flowers, all of it was sold to satisfy the ledgers, and the beautiful house that had tried so very hard to look old was at last revealed to own nothing but its debts. The society pages, which had so admired Lady Cressida's dinners, now printed every detail of her ruin and added with relish the tale of the noblewoman who had struck a princess of the blood across the arm in her own scullery and ordered her to confess her nothingness before a hall full of guests. England loves a fall even more than it loves a rise, and Cressida Vane fell very far indeed. There was, too, a deeper justice that reached across the cold sea, for the discovery that the lost princess of the White Pine yet lived changed everything in the north. The usurper who had seized her father's throne had ruled only because there was no rival blood left to rally the loyal. Now there was. When word reached the northern court that Annalise Sigrid Valdemar had been found alive and acknowledged by the king's own ambassador before a hall of English witnesses, the great families who had bowed to the usurper only out of fear began, very quietly, to bow no longer. Within the year, the cousin who had murdered his way to the White Pine throne found his support melting like spring ice beneath him, and he fled the marble palaces in the dark, much as Annalise had once fled them, and the throne was held in trust against the true heir's return. So the cruelty of a railway baroness in a cold English county. The spite that had ordered a princess to confess her name before strangers had set in motion the restoration of an ancient crown. The proud rarely understand how far the consequences of their cruelty travel. Lady Cressida had meant only to humiliate a servant. She had instead toppled a usurper across the sea. The brilliant marriage Ophelia had been groomed for evaporated like breath on glass. For no fortune in the county would now attach itself to a name so thoroughly disgraced. The baron, roused too late from his library, found himself a poor man and an object of pity, which for a proud man is the cruelest fate of all. Within a year the Vanes had given up Ellsworth Court entirely and retired to a small and shabby cottage in an unfashionable county where Lady Cressida, who had built her whole life upon being above others, discovered at last what it was to be beneath them. She was never struck. She was never harmed. She was simply, finally, no one, exactly as she had named the foreign girl. The world had only given her back her own words. And yet, even to Lady Cressida Vane, Annalise offered one last mercy, though few would have blamed her had she withheld it. On the morning the family was to leave Ellsworth Court for the last time, the creditor's men already carrying the stranger's portraits down the marble stairs, a single sealed letter arrived for Lady Cressida, written in the princess's own clear hand. It did not gloat. It did not accuse. It offered her a small annual sum, paid quietly from the restored northern treasury. Enough that she and her family would never starve nor sleep in the cold, on one condition only, that she spend the rest of her days remembering precisely why a stranger from across the sea had chosen to be kind to her when she had earned nothing but ruin. "You taught me," the letter ended, "how the powerful behave when they believe no one is watching. I have decided to behave differently. Consider this the last lesson you will ever teach me, and the first I now teach you. Whether Lady Cressida ever truly understood that letter, whether the lesson took root in a heart so long given to cruelty, no one could say. But she lived on the princess's mercy for the rest of her reduced and quiet life, and there is a kind of justice in that too. The justice of being kept alive by the very kindness one once mocked. But this is a story of grace as much as of justice, for the two are not enemies, whatever the cruel believe. Annalise did not forget the kitchens she had risen from. Before she crossed the cold sea homeward to the kingdom that had mourned her, she saw to it that every servant of that ruined house was paid in full at last, the long-owed wages drawn from her own restored fortune. And she carried with her, by her own choosing, the little scullery maid Sarah, who had once trembled at a dropped tray and a raised hand. The child who had taken a blow meant for no one, and the woman who had taken that blow for her crossed the winter sea together, and in the marble courts of the north Sarah grew up not as a drudge, but as a lady of the princess's own household, schooled and clothed and loved, and she never once forgot the gray-gowned woman who had whispered to her over a basin of broken crystal that even the longest winter ends. And Annalise herself, restored to her name and her crown, governed her northern realm not as the powerful so often do, with the cold pride she had endured for 7 years, but as one who has stood in the silence below the stairs and seen the true face the powerful show only to those they believe beneath them. She was beloved across 2 countries before she was through, the princess who came home from the dead, and the gentlest sovereign the white pine throne had ever known. As for the rumor that had brought the ambassador across the sea, the rumor that had seemed a phantom and a ghost, it had been true all along, and the only people who had ever doubted it were the very people who had poured their cruelty over the answer while she filled their cups. Power, in the end, is never proven by how grandly a person is treated. It is proven always and only by how they treat those they believe can do nothing for them. Lady Cressida Vane had 100 candles and 1,000 lilies and a name bought with railway money, and she was no one. A foreign drudge in gray wool, with chapped hands and a borrowed shawl, carried a crown inside her silence the whole 7 years, and she was a queen long before anyone bowed. Pride may wear diamonds, but character wears forever. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next royal drama. Tell us in the comments, did Lady Cressida deserve a second chance at the end of her fall? Or was the princess right to let the world strip her of everything she stole? And let us know where you are watching from and what time you finished this story. Until next time, remember that the longest winter always ends, and that the ones who keep their kindness through the cold are the only ones who truly wear a crown.